All right, here we go. So this is the review session for Unit 2 for EHAP. And as you can see, the topics we're going to cover are Absolutism, Constitutionalism, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. So let's get cracking, shall we? All right, so part one, basically the first part of this unit was about state building in Europe after 1648. And remember, there were two different sort of models of state building between 1648 and 1750 that we talked about. Absolutism and then constitutionalism. So, now 1648, remember, this was the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648. So, anyone remember the name of the treaty that ended the war? The Peace of Westphalia. And basically, as a result of the 30 Years' War, military systems became more technologically advanced, larger, more expensive to maintain, more organized. They required more sort of direct oversight by a government, more financing by a powerful national government. So basically, it became clear that after 1648, the only way that a country could really remain among the European powers was to have a strong centralized government that could collect taxes, that could organize and train armies that were professional. So basically the governments that we looked at among the great powers all sort of were trying to pursue these goals. So after the 30 Years' War then, there were two different models of how this was actually accomplished. On the one hand, you've got absolutist monarchies. On the other hand, you have constitutional governments. But basically, in both cases, the big issues they have to deal with are the same. How do we collect taxes? How do we maintain law and order? How do we basically just build our countries to remain relevant and powerful in this new sort of balance of power that has emerged? Now, the term balance of power, this is something we're going to see continuously over the course of European history. And after Westphalia, it really becomes sort of a thing that European countries really talk about. And European statesmen and monarchs and government officials really talk about continuously. The balance of power refers to the idea that if you are one of the great powers of Europe, you want to make sure that other powers don't become greater than you, don't outstrip your power, and that if a country looks like it's going to become more powerful than you, going to become, more powerful than other great powers, you want to try to stop that from happening by allying with other countries, by fighting against them, and trying to make sure that the balance of power is maintained. So, in the background of the sort of dispute about absolutism or constitutionalism, there's going to be the sort of ongoing just shifting of the balance of power as some countries become a little bit more powerful, a little bit less powerful, and countries will sort of ally with each other and shift their alliances to maintain some balance. So, now, in terms of absolutism, the first, the guy who basically, invented absolutism as we know it was Louis XIV. And there he is. He was part of the Bourbon dynasty of France. And remember, he was the guy he ruled France for 72 years. And it's going to be just kind of like a fact that when people rule a country for that long, they're going to kind of reshape the government in their image. And Louis XIV was obviously no exception to this. So he had the attitude, I am the state. And when he was very young, there was a brief rebellion against him by the nobility of France and by some of the towns of France trying to push their own power, trying to push for some independence. That was the Fronde Rebellion. And that was put down. But once he was old enough to rule on his own behalf, so about 18 or 19 years old, that is when he really had this attitude. I don't want to be rebelled against anymore. I want to have the nobles on my side, but out of my way, so I can just reshape the government and maintain French strength and basically make sure France grows in power, and that he personally wanted to also grow in power over the French state. So, some of the things he did that were notable, that were important to be aware of. He had a couple of really smart guys working for him, in particular Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And he was working for Louis as his finance minister until about 1683, so like early 1680s when he died. But while he was working for Louis, he reformed the French economy, trying to make it more modern, more efficient, and basically making it capable of equaling the economic growth of countries like England and like the Netherlands. So he encouraged Louis to invest in public works projects, infrastructure to make it easier to trade around France, and he had him build canals and roads and so on. He tried to like break the power of the guilds in the towns and cities to allow more production of consumer goods to occur all across France. He wanted to make the country a little more dynamic. Now, he also encouraged Louis to, develop the resources of their colonies in America. So in Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. So they encouraged fur trading and fur trapping in those areas for export back to Europe. So basically, he was trying to do things to make France a little bit more dynamic and productive and wealthy and so on. And it worked. And the French government started taking in much more tax revenue early in Louis's career. And that's something that helped him kind of like springboard to power. Because one thing about absolutist monarchs, without taxes, without money in their treasury, they won't be able to act independently. And France, because there was kind of a history in France of powerful monarchs to begin with, it was easier for him to, raise taxes and collect revenue off of all the economic activity that was going on. Now, you're going to see that in places where the monarch isn't able to develop revenue and really take in tax money without having to turn to nobles or without having to turn to like a parliament or some kind of representative body. It's really impossible to maintain the sort of independent power that a guy like Louis wanted to have. So now he reforms the government and basically makes it a little bit more centralized. And he does this through the system of intendants. So these kind of like government officials who go out to be the administrators and to oversee tax collection and law courts in the provinces around France. Now, they get into clashes with the local sort of councils, the Parlement, which were made up of nobles out in the countryside, powerful townspeople and bourgeoisie. So there's always going to be some resistance pushing back against his efforts to centralize the country, but he does move the needle toward more centralization and more central government power rather than sort of local power out in the provinces. Now, he also then sort of makes a deal with the elites of France. So the really sort of big landowning nobles and the sword nobles, the sort of old aristocratic families, those are the ones that he basically buys their loyalty by, giving them more power over the peasants on their land. He frees them from tax obligations, and he creates the sort of like theme park fantasy land of Versailles as a way to give them prestige and to sort of elevate them in status above the rest of French society and above the rest of European society. And in exchange, basically he expects them to allow him to make more government decisions on his own. So the people he actually hires, though, to like work in his government tend to be bourgeoisie, guys like Colbert, or they tend to be from the sort of lower ranks of the aristocracy. People who, because he's kind of elevating them to positions of authority and power and kind of making them as, officials and as leaders in society, he feels like he's able to control them and have more loyalty from them. So, but at the same time, though, he's still giving the upper aristocrats power and prestige in a sort of cultural sense rather than like a real political or economic sense. So now Versailles, of course, this becomes like a model of, prestige for the rest of Europe. And other monarchs will build their own like knockoff Versailles in order to try and capture some of the same kind of glory that Versailles created for Louis. And remember, what was the nickname he gave himself? The Sun King. Yeah, the Sun King. He wanted to create this sense that Versailles and Louis himself were literally like the center of the universe for France. And actually, that's kind of a good connection here. By the time that he called himself the Sun King, what did Europeans who were educated like him have to know about the solar system and the universe to be able to say that, yeah, that I just made that connection myself. Yeah, he was very into science, and he was into patronizing science and giving scientists, grants to come up with new discoveries and so on. So he was very aware of, Copernicus and heliocentric theories of the solar system, which is why he said he was the Sun King instead of, the Earth King. The Geo King. So now, in terms of religious policies, what was the one big religious decision he made?
He got rid of the edicts of Nantes.
Yeah, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, actually after Colbert was gone. And Colbert had been advising him to not do this, because Colbert saw very clearly what the consequences were going to be. If you target and persecute Protestant communities in towns and cities, the people who have wealth, who have business and skills and so on, some of them are just going to leave the country. And certainly there's going to be some backlash to this. So it did accomplish the goal of Louis establishing more personal control over the country and more personal control over the culture of the country. And it helped him strengthen his claim to divine right. And ultra-Catholics in France loved it, but it did sort of have a negative long-term consequence, a negative long-term impact for France. So, now, the last point here, wars. Basically, for almost Louis's entire career, he engaged in expansionist warfare along France's frontiers, trying to just bring more land and more resources into France. Now, early in his career, he went to war, against Spain. He went to war in Germany, basically just trying to pick up little bits of land along France's frontiers. And at first, this was actually kind of good for him in the sense that it brought him popularity, and the wars were sort of successful, and they didn't really drive France into debt. But then finally, he kind of tried to bite off more than he could chew. And the War of the Spanish Succession, where he was basically trying to help his grandson become the King of Spain, this was such a threat to the balance of power that literally every other country in Europe allied in order to resist this and try to block him from really establishing a puppet kingdom in Spain. So as a result of this war, this was kind of a disaster for France, because it went on so long and was so destructive and so expensive that it sent the French government deep into debt that they would really never get out of until the French Revolution. And this was one of the things that kind of set them on the path toward the French Revolution farther down the road. But this also, kind of exposed the limits of this absolutist model of government. That if a king was in power who believed so intensely and strongly in his just ability to always win and just always, and just always sort of have success, it might drive him to make some really sort of reckless decisions in pursuit of more personal and national power. So, now, next, yes, Alex.
What was Louis' grandson's name?
Oh, you go, Vault.
Was it Philip?
Yeah, it was Philip. Yes, thank you. So, now, Russian absolutism, this is another real stronghold of absolutist monarchy. And one of the earliest czars in Russia, one of the earliest Russian emperors who really kind of establishes this pattern of powerful central royal authority is Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible. And when he ruled Russia, this is when Russia really begins expanding toward the east and establishing the fur trade in Siberia. And they actually do start trading with Western Europe for the first time. But, Russia was still kind of isolated, and the capital was still at Moscow, which was relatively far to the east, and it was difficult to really sort of connect Moscow to the rest of Europe. But Ivan, though, he tried to overcome the power of the boyars, the nobles of Russia, by in some cases literally just killing them and taking over their land, and then using that to enrich himself, the government, and then use that as rewards for nobles who were loyal and those who were actually loyal to the central government. So, the real sort of big name, though, in Russian absolutism is Peter the Great. And Peter the Great, he was part of the Romanov dynasty. And Peter the Great, he had a couple of big goals for Russia. Number one, his single overarching goal was to make Russia closer to Western Europe in terms of their economic connections, their political connections, and he wanted to kind of give Western Europeans the sense that Russia was part of the club, that Russia was like joining Western Europe as just another European power. Whereas up until this point, Russia was kind of looked at by Western Europeans as sort of exotic and very sort of different. So, Peter then, he built a new capital city at St. Petersburg, which was along the coast of the Baltic Sea. And this was actually land that Russia took from Sweden in a major war that lasted a couple of decades, the Great Northern War. But at St. Petersburg, this was a capital city that was built partly as like pure propaganda, because he wanted Western Europeans to go to St. Petersburg as like the gateway to Russia and see, this like gleaming, beautiful Western style city with a palace that looked like Versailles. And also this was meant to be a naval base, and he expanded and built up the Russian Navy really for the first time as a way of projecting Russian power on the Baltic Sea. And this was a trade outlet, because this was a city that had basically direct access to Western Europe. So it was easier to just pursue trade connections with Western Europe if goods were flowing out and into Russia through that particular city. Now, in addition to westernizing, this kind of outlook on the world, he also tried to make the nobles, the boyars of Russia, literally become more Western. So he forced them to shave off their beards and to start like learning how to speak French and dressing in like the latest French styles, basically trying to present Russia as, a Western, thoroughly modern country. Now, he also, though, expanded royal power and centralized royal power even more. So he created a system called the Table of Ranks, where your title as a nobleman in Russia was directly linked to whatever kind of work you did on behalf of Peter and his government. So if you served as a government official, that would give you a certain noble title and certain, lands attached to that title. If you served as an officer in the army or navy, that would give you a noble title and would give you, access to some land and wealth that was controlled by Peter. So the Table of Ranks, it was a way of elevating people who were loyal to Peter into noble status. And it was a way of ensuring that people who were already nobles would take seriously the idea that they should actually be doing something useful and productive on behalf of the state. So, now he also expanded and professionalized the Russian military, and in some cases this was through conscription, and basically drafting peasants into the army and then putting them under the leadership of essentially this like professional aristocratic officer corps. So then he also centralized the religion of Russia. So the Russian Orthodox Church, up to this point, it was always connected to the monarchy, but Peter basically took the Orthodox Church and made it part of the state, and essentially tried to make sure that they were always supportive of him, and they were always supportive of the Russian state and the Russian government. And he essentially tried to turn the Russian Orthodox Church into a sort of like propaganda outlet for the czars. So, now as a result of Peter's time in power, though, so a couple of things have happened. Number one, Russia starts to really become a major economic power. They start to export more and more materials and resources to the West. And a huge amount of wealth is generated there. But it's really under the control of Peter and his government. And the vast majority of Russians are going to remain serfs, people who are really tied to the land as peasants, with really no, chance of escaping that. So, now, moving along to, yes,
the Great Northern War?
that was the war against Sweden
Oh.
that brought the Baltic coast under Russian control. Yeah. Yes. So, now in Central and Eastern Europe, a few things going on there to be aware of. Number one, after the 30 Years' War, now the Holy Roman Empire was kind of a dead letter. Like, it existed, and there was a title. There was an Austrian Habsburg with a crown on his head that said Emperor, but the Holy Roman Empire was really now just a bunch of independent kingdoms, principalities, duchies, bishoprics, etc. And the Austrian Habsburgs really could not claim power within the empire beyond the lands that they personally held. So Austria itself and Bohemia. And instead, they looked to the east. But the big rival there was the Ottoman Empire and Poland, Lithuania as well. So the Ottoman Empire, they had been expanding pretty steadily over the previous couple of centuries, but finally ran into trouble in the 1600s. They tried to besiege the city of Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Habsburgs, in 1683, but were turned back, partly because the military systems they ran into, in Austria and among some of Austria's allies that helped them, had really modernized as a result of the 30 Years' War, and the Ottomans had been kind of left behind. So once it was clear that they were sort of falling behind militarily, then the Austrian Habsburgs began to push back in the other direction, and over the course of a few decades, expanded to take over more of Hungary, and they brought that into their growing empire. So Austria kind of looked at Hungary then as like the second great pole, the second great sort of piece of their emerging empire of the East. But the thing is, though, as the Austrian Habsburgs expanded, they had to kind of make deals with the nobility in all of the countries they were taking over. Because, unlike France, for example, there wasn't quite as much homogeneity among the peoples they were ruling over. So Austrians and Czechs and Poles and Hungarians, all of these different sort of national groups wanted their own special rights and privileges. So it was difficult for the Austrian Habsburgs to really create a powerful centralized government. They really sort of had to make deals and give more sort of autonomy to the nobles of these countries in exchange for having the right to rule over them and claim them as part of their empire. Now, Prussia, though, this is where you see a more effective centralized government emerging under the Hohenzollern dynasty. And the Hohenzollerns, they ruled over kind of a few disparate areas that gradually they started to expand and take over the land that connected them as well. But the Prussians, though, they emerged out of the 30 Years' War as a very sort of centralized, militarized state. Because during the course of that war, they'd been defending themselves from the Austrian Habsburgs. And gradually, the Prussian kings, the Hohenzollerns, had really established a tight sort of control over the military system and the nobility of Prussia. And they, kind of like Peter the Great in Russia, created a system of service nobility, where to be a noble in Prussia, you had to serve in the army. You had to serve in the government. You had to show your loyalty and your willingness to actually work for the state and defend the state. Because they sort of now were in a position where they could rightfully claim, like, look, we defended Prussia from this onslaught by the Austrians. You need to basically get in line, or maybe they'll come back. Maybe we'll be under threat again. So this became a very powerful centralized state, but also one based on serfdom and a willingness by the Hohenzollern kings and the nobles underneath them to really sort of squeeze as much as they could out of the serfs of Prussia. But this was also a Lutheran state and was relatively tolerant, partly out of political necessity, because during the 30 Years' War, they had to be willing to ally with people of other religious denominations to defend themselves. And starting in the late 1600s, they absorbed some refugees from France as a way of kind of trying to gain an advantage over France as well. Now, the odd man out here in this, this rivalry among kingdoms in Eastern Europe was Poland-Lithuania, which for a couple hundred years had been a very sort of decentralized feudal state, where nobles had a lot of power to check the power of the monarchy. And it was so sort of vast that it was difficult for a monarch to really create a powerful centralized government in this kind of situation. And in addition, there were these kind of wild cards, the Cossacks, these, kind of like rogue military, this kind of like rogue military force and runaway serfs and so on, who lived in the eastern part of Poland and Lithuania, what's now the Ukraine, and kind of roved along this stretch of territory here. So that was another kind of push against the power of like a Polish king trying to centralize. So as these states surrounding Poland became more powerful during the 16 and 1700s, they basically looked at Poland and Lithuania as, as there for the taking. So as these states became more and more powerful, they started to expand. Sometimes, with the agreement of Polish nobles who wanted to get absorbed into these more powerful states surrounding them. Sometimes it was through violence, like when Russia took over part of what is now Ukraine from Poland and Lithuania. But basically, by the 1790s, Poland was literally gone from the map of Europe, and it had been carved up by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. These kind of like wolves, circling in to carve it up. Yes, the partitions of Poland. And this map illustrates, the actual dates of the different partitions. Now, initially, this was done to actually like avoid conflict among these bigger kingdoms, by just saying, listen, so we don't have to go to war to take over this land, and fight each other for control of it. Let's just agree. You take that, you take that, you take that. We'll all be happy, and we won't have to fight each other for control of this kingdom. Yes. So in the Russian Empire, so the very eastern part of Poland, that is where you had a relatively large Jewish population, and relatively large still. They were still a minority in that area, but compared to other parts of Europe, this is definitely where like the most Jewish people lived. So once this area was absorbed into the Russian Empire, this actually became kind of like an area where Jews were actually restricted to. They were not free to move to the rest of the Russian Empire. They really sort of had to stay in this area at the very far west of the Russian Empire.
So the Russians had control of that area?
Yeah, this was the part of Poland that the Russians absorbed. Yes.
Made by Catherine the Great, right?
Yeah, Catherine the Great was the one who, it was not just her, but, during her time in power is when, these partitions were really, like, agreed upon and when this expansion began. So, all right. So you can kind of look at this as, like, almost sort of like the scramble for Africa later on in the late 1800s, where a country that was perceived as weak by, kingdoms surrounding it, by people surrounding it, basically they decided amongst themselves how this partitioning was going to take place, and then basically just went in and took the land, after these agreements were made. Rather than fighting each other, they decided, let's just go and take this, but we'll make agreements to avoid conflict. Yes?
Who came before Catherine?
Who came before Catherine?
Yeah.
Well, that was Peter III, her short-lived husband. The one who,
She allegedly killed
and the thing about Peter, when we talk about Enlightened Absolutism, Peter III, he was like seriously all in on Enlightened Absolutism. Like he wanted to have like a parliament. He wanted to give like civil rights to everybody in Russia. So obviously we can't have a guy like that running the country, right? So now. So now, on the other side of this, so over in Western Europe, the great constitutional power of Western Europe is England. Now the thing is, though, England, their constitutional government, prior to the 1600s, basically the only real sort of written document that gave any rights to anybody in England was Magna Carta, which was signed back in 1215, which basically was like, King John telling the nobles of England, okay, I will allow the nobles to actually have some say in how I run this country. But it wasn't like, full rights for everybody. It was an agreement between the king and the nobles. But over time, though, that basic agreement had led to the creation of Parliament. And Parliament grew over time from being just the nobles and bishops in the church to being something that was a little bit more representative. Now, it wasn't a democracy. It wasn't like the Congress of the United States. The Parliament that existed in the early 1600s was still really just nobles, very high-level bourgeoisie, people who were very wealthy, and bishops in the church. So, now the House of Commons, though, within Parliament, that's where the bourgeoisie were represented, and that's where basically non-aristocratic landowners were represented. And that's where you had more sort of radical religious groups as well, like Puritans, who were kind of overrepresented because Puritans were actually sort of overrepresented among the bourgeoisie of England. And that was a development that had taken place over the course of the 1500s. So the relationship, though, between the Tudor dynasty, so like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and Parliament was there as kind of a partner with the monarchy. And generally, the Tudor monarchs were usually willing to work with Parliament and kind of acknowledge the role that Parliament played in the sort of traditional way of governing England. But once Elizabeth I died in 1603 with no children, the dynasty that took over, the Stuarts, who came down from Scotland, they were cousins of the Tudors, they did not have the same respect for Parliament within the system. And they really sort of didn't understand the expectation of Parliament in the system. So James I and Charles I, the first two Stuart kings, they had a very sort of difficult relationship with Parliament. Now, some nobles really loved these guys, but generally speaking, like the House of Commons really did not like them. And Charles, he was the one who actually, just dismissed Parliament for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, and said, I will go and raise taxes on my own. I will go and squeeze, taxes out wherever I can. I will try to, force the Anglican Church onto Ireland and Scotland and basically, make them, totally loyal to the English monarchy. So he, kind of like Louis XIV, started to bite off more than he could really chew. So when Charles I came, begging Parliament, please let me raise more taxes, please let me have a bigger army and hire more soldiers, Parliament, after he called it back into session in 1640, basically just demanded more of a sort of clearly defined role in the lawmaking process and the taxation process in England. So Charles was really kind of unwilling to give up any power, even though in 1640, because of the 30 Years' War and because of rebellions in Scotland and Ireland, he needed Parliament. He needed to work with them, but he really just kind of refused to. So he declared war against Parliament, and Parliament, fought back. Oliver Cromwell led the parliamentary army in a civil war against the royalists that were loyal to Charles I. And ultimately, the Civil War ended up with Parliament defeating the royalists, and Charles got his head cut off. So for 11 years then after that, England had no monarch at all. And this was terrifying, yes. Yes, Charles I. He got his head cut off. I mean, he didn't just get it cut off. People cut it off. So yeah, so this word here, interregnum, means between the reigns. So between the reign of one king and then the reign of another king. So for 11 years then, there was no king. And this is when, like, from the perspective of the nobility, from the perspective of, like, of monarchs elsewhere in Europe, England just went totally crazy for 11 years from their perspective. And this is when you have, very radical groups emerging, asking for things, well, not asking, but like, trying to stage uprisings in order to get democracy and voting rights and representation in parliament and, full toleration for all, religious groups. Hmm? So,
How dare they?
Toleration.
and England was a place, England was like relatively tolerant already, as long as you weren't like too Catholic, you were basically okay. So, but groups like the Diggers that wanted like basically communism, that wanted like equal distribution of land to all of the peasants around England. Groups like this emerged, and Cromwell, who was elite within English society, even though he wasn't, an aristocrat, he and his allies in Parliament decided that this was unsustainable. And in addition, like, the rebellions were still ongoing and had to be put down, like, brutally by Cromwell. So he disbanded Parliament and just basically made himself a military dictator in 1653. So, during this time while England was a republic, when they had no monarch, basically there was so much turmoil that by the end of all of this, by the time Cromwell died, you had some very powerful elements within English society, even among the House of Commons, even among the bourgeoisie, who thought, what, we need to, like, get things back a little bit to the way they were. We need to still have a monarch as just kind of like, a sort of stable focus of English society. So in 1660, Parliament is back under Cromwell's son, and they basically vote to invite the Stuart dynasty back to power. Now, Charles II, the first Stuart king who comes back, he had fled to France for a few years, and now he's invited back to England. There's a kind of understanding here that the monarch will allow Parliament to be more involved. But it's not really sort of written down and set in stone just yet. Now, Charles, though, because he had been living in France and basically palling around with Louis XIV, for about a decade, there was always some suspicion that even though he was like the legitimate king of England and was from the Stuart dynasty, that he was really kind of too friendly with Louis, and that he was kind of a puppet of Louis, and that he was actually intending to kind of restore Catholicism to England in order to make it closer to France. Yes.
What was Cromwell's son's name?
Was it Richard? Richard?
I guess.
Yeah. You don't really have to know that. So, and I might be wrong about that, because that's something that I have to like look up every year, and then I forget it every year. So Charles, though, the fact of the matter was, he actually was secretly Catholic, and he was actually sort of like intending to restore Catholicism to England, when he felt strong enough to do so. And he was literally on the payroll of Louis XIV. So, Louis, he made a habit of like putting nobles and putting powerful people on his payroll with the goal of keeping them loyal to him and just kind of out of his way. So Charles, he put him on his payroll. And Charles, was intending to more closely align England with France. So Parliament passed the Test Act in 1673 to limit his ability to, sort of bring Catholicism back to English government. So, now after Charles died, though, his brother James II comes to power, and he is openly Catholic. He's aggressively Catholic. He makes it clear he's going to ignore the Test Act. He's going to basically sort of, bring this relationship with Parliament back to the way it was under the early Stuart kings. So this is when the Whigs in Parliament, the people in Parliament who are really sort of, less inclined to support royal power, they invite William and Mary. So Mary was James's daughter, but she had become Protestant and gone to the Netherlands to marry William of Orange, the leading aristocrat of the Netherlands. So they're invited to come back to England and take the throne of England on the promise that they will sign the Bill of Rights and essentially just declare that Parliament is really kind of the supreme force in English government, and that there are certain rights that Parliament just simply has, that the king cannot stop, or that the Queen cannot, go back against. So in the Bill of Rights, even though once again this doesn't give the same rights to all Englishmen, it is a huge step forward in establishing clearly defined limits on government and constitutional government, and making sure that at least the elites of England have a clearly defined role in the process of lawmaking and taxation and so on. And eventually this does become kind of a big stepping stone towards something like full constitutional rights and liberties for all Englishmen farther down the road. Yes? Oh, okay. So, all right. So, anything?
Actually, I do have a question.
Yes.
Who was Oliver Cromwell again?
He was a member of Parliament who led the parliamentary armies in the English Civil War against Charles I and defeated him, and then basically became the military dictator of England during the late 1650s. So, now, another constitutional power in Europe, though, was the Dutch Republic. And unlike England, the Dutch Republic, from the moment it became independent from the Spanish Habsburgs back in the 1580s, they had no monarch. So, and at the end of the 30 Years' War, they were officially recognized in the Treaty of Westphalia as a fully independent republic, which was huge. The idea that other countries in Europe that were led by monarchs actually signed a piece of paper saying, yes, it is okay for this country to not have a monarch at all. So, the Dutch Republic then had a constitutional government that, kind of like in England, it was really dominated by elites. In this case, you had merchant elites and commercial elites, people who were bankers, businessmen, engaged in trade. So it was really kind of an oligarchy, but it was still a government that was not dominated by a monarch. And, these elites were the ones who had power, but it was still, a step closer to a democratic style of government. So, in addition, this system of government did allow for more religious toleration. And this was probably the most religiously tolerant country in all of Europe in the 1600s. And they also absorbed refugees from France. This was really one of the only places in Europe where it was actually kind of acceptable to be Jewish. And even Catholics had rights, as long as they weren't actively seeking out to convert people within the Netherlands. So, now, during the late 1600s, though, to some extent, the sort of internal peace in the Netherlands was based on the fact that it was a really economically successful country, and that the standard of living in the Netherlands was the highest of any country in Europe. So it was kind of easier for people in the Netherlands to get along with each other because there was no sense that groups in the Netherlands were really fighting each other or scrapping against each other for economic success. So their economic success, though, wasn't based on huge farmland, but on international trade and their control of the spice trade into Europe and their control of colonies overseas. And they also were very successful in the slave trade. But in the late 1600s, though, they did fight a series of wars against England and against France that resulted in them losing some colonies and really being kind of relegated to a second-tier military power in Europe. But they still had a great deal of financial success and success in international trade, even though they didn't necessarily have the military power of a country like England or France. Yes?
Are they always called? Why are
Well, this is something we're going to get to later in chapter 17, actually. But these companies, though, the Dutch East India Company was, well, they were given a charter by the Dutch government that specifically granted them a monopoly over the trade between the Netherlands and the East Indies. So, which included basically like all of Asia. So it's called the Dutch East India Company because it was a Dutch company that did trade with East India, or with the East Indies. So this company, though, they were actually the ones who, took over and then developed like spice plantations in Indonesia. And they actually had like their own private army and navy that helped them like make sure to guarantee their like access to trade overseas. But they were the first joint stock company. So they were the first company where just like average people in the Netherlands could actually invest money and buy shares of the stock in the hope of making some profit on the back end. Yes?
So you say there was slavery in the Dutch, was it like slavery everywhere else, or did they have like a little
So there were Dutch merchants who were engaged in exporting and shipping slaves from Africa to the Americas. So there weren't really like slaves in the Netherlands itself, but instead you had a huge amount of wealth being generated by Dutch merchants who were engaged in the slave trade across the Atlantic. So, okay. Now, also, we talked about Dutch Golden Age painting. So this was a particular painting style that became popular among the commercial elites of the Netherlands, that more so than really any other country, this artistic style really kind of celebrated just the everyday life of merchants and commercial elites in a place like Amsterdam. So, Dutch Golden Age painting as well, because it's influenced by Calvinism, there's no religious imagery. It's iconoclastic. But instead, you have merchant elites who had money and wanted beautiful works of art in their house. So, the things that were suitable to paint within that kind of religious and cultural context was just life itself. So, portraits and images, celebrating the guilds that controlled the life, the business of the towns and cities of the Netherlands. And it was very just realistic. There was no embellishment, no weird surrealism like in Mannerist or like Baroque style. But instead you had just, here are Dutch people living their lives. So, now, part 2 of Unit 2. We're going to go through this stuff pretty quickly, since this is more recent. So, alongside these political shifts that are going on, you also have some big intellectual changes. So, number one, the scientific revolution. And the way of thinking that emerges in the scientific revolution can simply just be referred to as the new science. This new sort of scientific worldview that replaces natural philosophy, that replaces scholasticism. These sort of not really scientific ways of thinking about the natural world. Oh, Vince is at the door. So, now remember though, the old science was based on kind of a hodgepodge of ideas that were passed down from the ancient Greeks, so guys like Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and had kind of made their way through the Arab world and the Middle East, and then back into Europe, after the Crusades and the fall of Constantinople. But the new science, though, was really kind of based on the idea that rather than just accepting old ideas as they are passed down to us, let's actually put them to the test and experiment and see if those ideas are correct, or see if there is a different truth out there. See if there is, to see if the way that the natural world works is different than the way that it's been sort of passed down to us. So the first place where this, or the first type of science where this way of thinking really became prominent, and that yielded really the most famous discoveries of the scientific revolution, was in astronomy, starting with Copernicus, and then Kepler and Galileo, and Isaac Newton. And you should know just the ideas or the sort of contributions to astronomy and just the understanding of the universe that each of these guys was responsible for. So Copernicus, what was, yeah, the H word, heliocentrism.
It's a Haleolithic, whatever that
Haleolithic. So Kepler was the one who contributed elliptical orbits. Galileo was the one who started inertia and just this sort of concept of gravity as a force holding objects in motion around each other. And he also was the one who developed the telescope and saw like craters on the moon and moons around Jupiter. And he was also the one who, because he was particularly, inclined to push pretty far in like really popularizing these ideas, and because of the fact that he stayed in Italy for his whole career instead of going somewhere where they wouldn't have cracked down on this. The Catholic Church, they put him under house arrest because he refused to give up these ideas and stop writing about them. So, Isaac Newton, though, he was the capstone. He was the one who came up with the mathematical language to describe the motion of objects in space. So this was the Newtonian synthesis, this understanding of the natural laws and equations that govern the motion of objects in the universe, and that could be used to predict motions, or the motion of objects in the universe, as if it were a big machine, as if it were just like a giant mechanical clock that had been wound up and turned on. So, now this swept away the old ideas about geocentrism and, the ideas about like objects being connected to giant spheres that were like moving around each other. So, now another place where there's big changes is anatomy and physiology. So Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey, they talked about the skeletal and muscular systems and the cardiovascular systems, and basically sort of thinking about the body also as a system, a sort of mechanical system in which these different pieces of the body and different systems work in concert with each other to actually control the motion and actually disease in the body as well. Vince, did you have a question?
What did Kepler do again? Inertia?
Elliptical orbits of objects around the sun. Yes.
Which was the guy that was like blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile?
The four
Galen.
elements?
The four humors. Yeah. So, guys like Vesalius and William Harvey, their ideas about a more sort of systematic understanding of the body, once again, just swept all that away.
And I would say this is like anatomy, cardiac, circulation of blood.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now, all of these new observations, though, were based on the scientific method. And this is the method of experimenting, hypothesizing, drawing conclusions, and really sort of putting ideas to the test to see if they really are helping you arrive at the truth. So, Francis Bacon, right here, and René Descartes, these are the two big names in popularizing this way of thinking. Descartes actually came first, and deductive and inductive reasoning, you should know the difference between them. But inductive reasoning, this was the one that was based on empiricism, where you simply have to make observations, run experiments, and then draw your conclusions entirely from what you have actually seen and observed and what the results of your experiment are. So, this way of thinking then, the scientific method, gradually becomes more and more popular among educated elites within Europe. And this becomes really like the basis for a whole new sort of culture of science. And that's really the difference between the new science versus science as it existed in earlier civilizations and earlier in Europe. Then now you have a whole sort of like world of people in Europe that are reading each other's ideas, that are constantly testing new ideas and retesting old ideas and trying to really sort of acquire and then refine knowledge in order to arrive at a more and more and more exact understanding of how the universe works. Rather than just like individuals that are sort of far-flung, now you have really people sort of building on each other constantly. So, now, one of the big venues for the new science was scientific societies, which quite often were patronized by elites and monarchs, like Louis XIV, with the goal of enhancing their own prestige, but also facilitating and encouraging new scientific ideas for their own benefit and for the benefit of their states. Now, the biggest scientific society and the most prestigious was the one in England, the Royal Society of London, which was founded in 1660 under the leadership of Charles II, and was actually presided over by Newton for several years late in the 1700s.
Until they came.
The Royal Society of London, well, until he died.
And they were so happy.
Well, I mean, I don't know. They were mixed feelings because on one hand, some scientists were happy that this like annoying guy is out of their lives, but on the other hand, he was literally the most intelligent human being on the face of the earth. So that's kind of a big loss. So
They said England or France?
England. Okay. So
Plus the loons.
so some of the effects here. So number one, there's going to be some big changes in the way that European elites think about religion and philosophy. So you start to see more religious attitudes that were kind of based on this mechanistic understanding of the universe, and this idea that, hey, perhaps humans are not the center of creation. Perhaps God is not intervening, in the lives of humans all the time. So you start to see more and more skepticism about religion and philosophy within European elites. So, yes.
Well, deism or deism?
Deism with a D. That was the new sort of religious idea that basically said, yes, there's a God who created the universe, but he's like a mechanical engineer. And he built this machine and turned it on. And he actually wants us to like figure out how it works. He gave us powers of mind and reason for the purpose of understanding this creation that he has made and given to us. So, now, onto the Enlightenment. So, the Enlightenment was basically taking the scientific revolution and applying it to human society and human institutions and human behavior. So, Isaac Newton and John Locke as well were really the big sort of, not founders of the Enlightenment, but the people who were really the intellectual godfathers of the Enlightenment. So Newton's ideas about like a sort of mechanistic, rational universe that was governed by natural laws is something that will be hugely influential. Because then you start seeing people think, okay, well, natural laws govern the way planets move. Maybe there are natural laws about how humans behave and think, and the way that governments work, and the way that law works. And we can figure that out. We can learn those things, and then use that knowledge to make the world better. Just like we improve our scientific understanding of the universe, we can improve the way we understand and behave within society. And then John Locke, he was the great defender of the Glorious Revolution, the guy who really did the most to popularize the idea that government is based not on divine right, but on social contract, based on popular sovereignty. The fact that the people need to actually be willing to allow government to exist in order for it to be legitimate. Yes?
So is Locke considered a enlightened thinker or just like a free thinker?
Well, he's kind of both. I guess it depends on your perspective here. Because he also was a big advocate of religious toleration. He was an advocate of natural rights. And he was a big advocate of the idea that individuals, rather than like groups within society, have rights. And that everyone should have their natural rights respected, regardless of social class or rank or prestige. So what was the phrase he used to describe this idea that when everyone is born, they're blank, they're equal. Yeah. So that was meant to say, listen, people can become educated, but it also meant that everyone was equal when they were born. That everyone had the same natural rights, everyone started from the same place, and therefore everyone's natural rights should be respected. So, now, in the notes that we had about the Enlightenment, there was that big table showing you Enlightenment ideas that were sort of popular among the philosophes. So you should know just very broadly like what the major ideas were that were popular among Enlightenment thinkers and the people who were supportive of Enlightenment thinkers. And you should know the specific ideas, just one or two specific ideas associated with each of the big names among the philosophers. So Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu, he was the one who was all about checks and balances as a way to make sure that, there was no tyranny within government. So he was very much against the idea of absolute monarchy. Then you had Voltaire. He was best known for his defense of religious liberty and religious toleration. He was like the most famous just because he was, the wittiest. And when you get like kicked out of a bunch of countries because you're just like too edgy, And once again, like I made the point the first time we talked about these guys, they understood, just like Martin Luther did, the power of the press, the power of pushing the envelope in order to just kind of get your ideas out there into the public sphere. And Voltaire was more than happy to do that in order to make sure that his books were selling and that he got invited to the salons and the courts and so on. So, Diderot and D'Alembert, they were the ones who compiled the Encyclopedia, this idea that it was actually good and possible for all of the knowledge to be collected as a way of then, expanding knowledge based on that. Cesare Beccaria, he was the guy who was all about criminal justice reform and that law should be, applied fairly. Prevention over punishment. Yeah. And he was against, capital punishment. He was against torture. And basically had the idea that, hey, laws should apply to everyone in exactly the same way. And law shouldn't be a tool of the powerful against the powerless, but a tool of actually protecting everyone's rights instead. So, Immanuel Kant, he was a Prussian philosopher who thought that Enlightenment was entirely an individual pursuit. And that, hey, maybe some people just aren't really capable of enlightenment. Well, So, Rousseau, he wrote about the social contract as well. And he also was the one who was considered very radical. And he wrote late in the 1700s. Yeah. So communists were into him. But also, some like conservative religious reformers were into him as well, because of his idea that in order to really like make people sort of understand their obligations to each other and their obligations to society as a whole, they needed to be educated not in terms of like not in terms of like, reading books and training to be a doctor when they're a child, but instead learning values and morals. So religious thinkers later on will look at him as a model for, hey, we actually do need to like teach people morals and values so they understand how to like be good people. Yes.
Was that Hume?
Okay. So Hume, he was a big religious skeptic and extremely critical of religious institutions. And he also, kind of like Rousseau, they both kind of questioned whether rationalism could really solve all our problems. And Rousseau, once again, another really sort of radical idea of his was that he thought that individualism had actually gone a little too far. And that by emphasizing this idea that everyone has individual rights that cannot be infringed upon or, must be respected at all costs, he felt that people took this too far. And it meant that you were free to just literally do anything you want. And that actually led to, decadence and immorality and a sort of lack of understanding of people's obligations toward each other and toward society as a whole. So, okay, and then Adam Smith was all about economic freedom and economic rights. Yes?
Was like Hume the guy who talked about theism?
Oh, David Hume?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he was a deist, and some philosophers actually did go so far as to advocate atheism entirely, but that was something that was still very, very rare, even among like the most radical philosophers. So, now, finally, then, last slide.
Wait, what did Beccaria do?
Beccaria, he was the one who was into criminal justice reform and, reforming legal codes to make them more fair and just and so on. So, finally then, the places where the Enlightenment happened, were coffee houses, salons, royal and noble courts, among the royals and nobles who actually were willing to consider Enlightenment ideas, and secret societies as well, like the Freemasons and Illuminati.
The real one.
Yeah, the real Illuminati, not the not the like alien conspiracy theory one. So, not the ones who are like trying to turn humans into lizard people or something. Is that something?
That's a totally different thing.
That is?
Yeah,
Whatever. It all. Whatever.
it all connects.
It's all nonsense. It's all nonsense. Actually, I shouldn't say that on YouTube because now I'm probably going to get like an army of trolls like telling me that that I'm totally wrong.
Flat earthers.
Yeah, they're going to like bombard the comments for this video.
The president's
So, all right. So now, also then, the growth of literacy in some parts of Europe also led to the popularization of Enlightenment ideas. And once again, in countries like France, England, the Netherlands, where literacy rates were higher, due to religious, basically due to Protestantism in some of those places, but just due to like overall sort of economic development happening in those places as well. As literacy rates grew, more people became aware of these ideas and were willing to advocate for them and push for them. So public opinion became a real thing that governments had to be responsive to. And you start to see that even some monarchs start to take seriously the idea that they need to be responsive to public opinion, and they need to actually promote Enlightenment ideals through the exercise of their royal power. Now, in the Enlightenment, though, women, once again, like every cultural movement we've seen in Europe, there's a debate among the people sort of leading this movement about exactly what the place of women is in culture and society. So the general attitude among the philosophers was really that, and especially someone like Rousseau, we read a document by him where he basically explained, listen, women and men are sort of scientifically separate, and biology and nature have sort of granted them different roles within the world and in society. So Rousseau took Enlightenment ideas and scientific ideas and used it to justify, separating gender roles within society and essentially keeping women in a position of subservience to men. Rousseau. Yes?
Wasn't there that other language where it was like stonecraft?
There she is right there, Mary Wollstonecraft. Yeah, who we're going to see her again when we get to the French Revolution.
Do we need to know her?
Yeah, you might want to, but she's someone who's going to become more important later on, I think. She's one of the earliest, feminists, I guess you could say. Someone who writes specifically for the purpose of defending, the ability of women to become educated for the betterment of mankind. Oh, well, she wrote responses to all sorts of, issues regarding women. Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was English. So, and remember, in those documents we read in class, about the Enlightenment, she was actually one of the writers who you read. So, and she was defending women's education, from attack by guys like Rousseau. What's that?
It was an argument. It was like, give women education so they can educate their children.
Yeah. Yeah. And, she also drew a link between, keeping women uneducated and slavery. And basically said, listen, if you intentionally just, deny some part of human society to be allowed to educate themselves and become productive and, contribute to society, that's bad for everybody. Not just the people who are being denied those rights. So, Finally, then you have enlightened absolutism. Oh yeah, and also one other thing that's happening in the Enlightenment is that women actually became some of the most famous patrons of the philosophes, and some of the most famous organizers of salons, these venues, these kind of social gatherings where philosophes and their ideas would become popularized. So the most famous salonière was a woman in Paris named Madame Marie de Geoffrin. So, now, in the late 1700s then, some monarchs decided that they actually needed to pursue Enlightenment goals for multiple purposes. Number one, because they felt like they had no choice, because public opinion was turning in that direction. And on the other hand, they also felt like they could use Enlightenment ideals to justify expanding their own power. So a guy like Frederick the Great of Prussia, he basically thought, I can claim that because I want to defend the rights of the people and create a fair law code, that will justify me taking power away from the nobles and putting more government power under my own authority in order to promote this Enlightenment principle. So, now, Frederick the Great, Joseph II of Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, one thing that kind of unified all of the enlightened absolutists, they all pushed for some religious toleration. This was something that was becoming much, much more widespread in the late 1700s. This just basic attitude that, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, basically proved hey, as long as you're not hurting anybody, it's pretty much okay to have whatever religion you want. And religion became much more of a private matter rather than an issue of public concern. So they all emphasized, religious toleration. They also wanted to modernize the educational institutions of their countries by, putting it under direct government control and essentially creating a system where modern science and mathematics and so on were taught more often to more people in the educational systems of their countries. Now, Joseph II, though, he was the one who went the farthest and, abolished serfdom in the Austrian Habsburg territories and, really kind of seriously diminished the role of the Catholic Church in Habsburg lands. And he also, tried to create a fair taxation system where even nobles had to pay taxes. And unfortunately, for him, he went so far that after he died, there was backlash. And his brother, who took the throne after him, kind of felt like he was forced to roll back a lot of these reforms under pressure from the nobility of the Austrian Habsburg kingdoms. Yes, yeah. Now, Frederick the Great, he also wanted to get rid of serfdom, but he felt like he didn't have really the political capital to go quite that far. Whereas, Frederick. So he wanted to create more economic opportunity, and on his own land, many of the serfs on his own personal land were freed. But he didn't feel like he would have been able to go all the way and abolish serfdom entirely without facing a huge amount of backlash from the nobles of Prussia. Now, Catherine the Great, though, she actually tightened serfdom even more. And the rights of serfs in Russia actually declined under her rule, partly as backlash against Pugachev's rebellion, the peasant uprising that actually threatened to overthrow her in the 1770s. So by the time that Catherine was gone, serfs had actually lost some rights, and nobles in Russia had actually gained rights and were actually freed from state service. So they no longer had to abide by the table of ranks that Peter the Great had created 100 years earlier. So, any questions? That was a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I tell you, I wrote so much.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the stream. Stop streaming.